Happy Independence Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of the original Medal of Honor from 1999 on the PlayStation 1. This is a first-person shooter developed by DreamWorks Interactive and published by Electronic Arts in 1999 exclusively for the PlayStation 1, although it was later re-released on PlayStation Network as part of their PS1 Classics initiative. And in addition to being ridiculously well-received on launch, it went on to become one of the most influential first-person shooters of its era and has generally been credited with popularizing the World War II first-person shooter. The thing about saying that this popularized World War II first-person shooters, however, is that it wasn't just popularization of World War II shooters that was happening around this era. It was World War II media in general, thanks to the 1998 release of the film Saving Private Ryan. Now, of course, Medal of Honor does have a very direct relationship with Saving Private Ryan because Steven Spielberg, the director of the film, not only was directly involved with the game's development as a writer and producer, but also helped to found DreamWorks Interactive itself. And obviously it all worked out pretty well, at least in the short term, because not only was Medal of Honor itself wildly successful, but the franchise it spawned continued to be successful for the ensuing decade, until EA horribly mismanaged it as of Medal of Honor 2010 and Medal of Honor Warfighter and effectively killed the franchise. There was, of course, the brief aside that was Medal of Honor Above and Beyond, which is the VR exclusive game that I will probably never be covering because I don't really see myself getting a VR set. But that's the only significant release that this franchise has gotten since Medal of Honor Warfighter released back in 2012, and that was 4 years ago as I'm recording this review. So there's no sign, as of recording this review anyway, that the Medal of Honor franchise is ever going to get any kind of revival. And that's not exactly surprising either. While Medal of Honor itself might have been fresh back in 1999, it wasn't fresh for very long because the World War II media craze caused a lot of World War II games to get released over the ensuing several years, and people got pretty burned out on World War II games quite quickly. I know that's hard to imagine for modern gaming audiences because there haven't been that many World War II games released in the past decade or so, but between the release of the original Medal of Honor in 1999 and the release of Call of Duty 4 in 2007, there were just so many World War II games being released that we were practically begging studios to do literally anything else. Because the simple fact of the matter is, that's just what happens when you have the same battles being depicted over and over and over again. You just get sick of doing the same things over and over and over again. That wasn't the case back when this particular game released, of course, because it was fresh and different, but the same cannot be said for the ensuing Medal of Honor games, all of which I've played. The only ones in this series that I had not played prior to going into the original Medal of Honor were the original Medal of Honor Underground, and Medal of Honor Infiltrator, which was the top-down GBA game that might as well not even factor into the equation because it's not a first-person shooter like all the other ones. You may think to yourself that sounds kind of insane considering that I've been gaming as long as I have and I haven't played the original Medal of Honor all the way through until now. But the simple fact of the matter is, I didn't have a PlayStation back in the day. My gaming console journey went from Atari 2600 to Atari 7800 to Sega Genesis to Atari Jaguar, and then from there, the next console I got was my GameCube. I missed out on nearly the entirety of the PS1 and N64 generation, except for the barely a handful of games that I got to mess around with when I was hanging out with other people at the time. And most of those were Nintendo 64 games. I barely had any exposure to PlayStation games at all until I finally got a PlayStation 4. That should tell you just how much of the PlayStation library I've missed out on. The thing is that even when I go back to these games now, I still have tons of problems actually messing around with them. I can't stand the way the DualShock controller is set up. It's just horrendously non-ergonomic, and in fact, if you hold it in the completely logical way that I held that controller back in the day, which is index and middle fingers on the shoulder buttons, then it's downright uncomfortable, and in my particular case, if I do that for longer than a couple of minutes, it actually ends up cramping my hands up. So even when I had an opportunity back in the day to mess around with PlayStation games, it generally hasn't gone well. Now, of course, Sony redesigned the DualShock controller as of the PlayStation 4, so now it is actually much more ergonomic and much more comfortable, but going back and playing PS1, PS2, and PS3 games is often pretty rough, even though I do hold the controller differently now than I did back in the day. So you can probably see immediately where this might be a problem going back and messing around with the original Medal of Honor. It's already at a disadvantage just by nature of the controller its system uses. Then there's the matter of it being a console first-person shooter that requires you to aim up and down. There's another major sticking point, because while console controls work perfectly fine for 2D first-person shooters like, say, Doom, in the case of a 3D first-person shooter like Medal of Honor, where you have to aim in 3 dimensions, the sluggishness and imprecision of gamepad controls is always going to interfere with the experience. Even more so when you're dealing with the PS1 era, where they hadn't quite figured out dual analog stick controls yet. Now, Medal of Honor mercifully has a few control schemes where you aim with the right stick and move with the left stick, as opposed to a lot of the more common control schemes of the era, some of which it does also include as options as well. But even with control schemes that are a lot closer to what we consider to be modern gamepad controls for first-person shooters, there are still some odd button placements, and it still just feels clunky to use regardless. That's just kind of a problem of the era in general, and I don't really hold it against Medal of Honor specifically, but it is something I want to mention because it still interfered with the experience of messing around with this game. But then there's the third and nastiest problem going into this particular game, which is, I've already played all of the subsequent games in this series except for Underground and Infiltrator, which means that I've done basically everything the original Medal of Honor game does several times. This means that I look at the stuff that was exciting and fresh for audiences back in 1999, and I cannot help but see it as incredibly stale, because I've just done it so many times already. This kind of thing is why I generally prefer and generally advocate people go into series with the very first game and then work their way through the subsequent ones, even if those subsequent games are considerably better. That way you're starting with the earliest, roughest implementation of whatever sets that series apart, and then working your way through the refinements from there. That's not what I've been able to do with the Medal of Honor franchise, and so going back to the original entry after having played so many of the subsequent games has been a remarkably frustrating experience. And I bring all of this up before I even get into the meat of the review proper, because I need you to understand a few things. The first is that I have absolutely no nostalgia for this game whatsoever, so that's not going to cloud any judgment that I have here. Now, I don't think most people are necessarily going to have a problem with that, because it means I can be more objective than people who did play it back in the day and do have nostalgia for it. But what is going to cloud my judgment are my general dislike of console controls for first-person shooters, which is something that applies to every console first-person shooter, not just Medal of Honor. So that's not really going to factor much into the review unless it does something specific with the controls that really does need to be called out. And the other big thing that is going to affect my ultimate judgment on this thing is the simple fact that I'm going back to Medal of Honor after having played nearly every game in the series subsequent to it. And since pretty much everything the original Medal of Honor does was recycled in later entries in the series, it means I'm going back to the earliest, rawest implementation of those series ideas after having played through more refined subsequent versions of them. Not to mention, I was there right along for the ride with the massive oversaturation of World War II games, so I'm still pretty burned out on World War II in general. And unfortunately, with that particular bias, I can't really do anything about it other than just acknowledge its existence and continue on through the review as objectively as I can manage. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and delve right on into this thing and see what exactly we're dealing with here and how well it holds up all these years later. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, bearing of course in mind that this is an early 3D game from the PlayStation 1 era. And more specifically, as I'm recording this review, it was released nearly 25 years ago, so obviously it's going to look extremely dated by modern standards, although funnily enough, the PlayStation 1 aesthetic is making something of a comeback in the indie space right now, so kind of an interesting what's old is new again situation right now. But anyway, obviously what we're dealing with here is rather blocky, low-poly models with very low-res textures, and as was pretty typical for PlayStation 1 games, the textures have a habit of warping as you move around through the levels. Like I said, this was a common problem for PlayStation 1 games of the era, and it's just an odd quirk of the way the PlayStation 1 renders things. But while back in the day it was something of an eyesore effect. Weirdly enough, a lot of people find it pleasingly retro these days. I think that's really just the nostalgia speaking. People played PlayStation 1 games back in the day. They look back on it now, and that's a weird quirk that didn't really affect the games all that much, but it did look rather odd and distinct, so people end up looking back on it fondly, even though it wasn't looked at fondly in its day. Now, regardless of how you feel about the texture warping effect, there are a few things about the visuals that are pretty difficult to ignore. The first of these is the rendering distance, which was a fairly common problem with a lot of console first-person shooters of the era, because they were trying to maximize performance however they could, and one of the ways they would do this is by restricting the distance at which they would be rendering objects, characters, that sort of thing. Now, most of the time you're wandering around in fairly confined areas, so it's really not that much of a problem in those sequences, but in areas where the levels open up a bit more, it can actually be a problem because enemies can shoot at you from beyond the rendering distance, and even if you zoom in with the sniper rifle, for example, the rendering distance still doesn't change, so enemies will still be shrouded in darkness and still shooting at you, and you just have to sort of guess where they are. When it's enemies that are shooting at you with rifles or submachine guns or pistols, not that big of a deal. Not so much the case when they introduce the Panzerschreck wielding enemies, because those enemies are able to kill you in one shot. At that point, the rendering distance stops being a mild annoyance at absolute worst and becomes a pretty serious irritant. Another difficult to ignore problem is the frame rate, mostly because it is very inconsistent. Now, a lot of the time the frame rate is actually fairly smooth. It's not 60 FPS, it barely maxes out at 30, but it's smooth enough to where even if you do experience a few frame rate drops here or there that are maybe 5 or so FPS, it's not that big of a deal, and it doesn't really impact your ability to play the game. But then there are times when it's rendering multiple enemies on screen at once, or a lot of level geometry, and suddenly the frame rate absolutely tanks, to the point where not only is it going well below 20 frames per second, sometimes it even gets below 10 frames per second, which is extremely noticeable and very significantly affects your ability to play the game. Now sure, this was a fairly common problem for early 3D games in general, let alone early 3D first-person shooters on console, but just because it was a common problem doesn't make it any less egregious. If your frame rate drops enough to where it significantly affects gameplay, it's a problem, regardless of what game it is, regardless of what system it's on, and regardless of how many other games perform either the same or worse. You gotta remember, this is long before the days of being able to deploy a patch to a console game to improve its optimization and performance. What shipped on the disc is what you got, and what shipped on the disc did not include any kind of graphics options to prioritize performance, and there was no way of upgrading the console to get better performance. Thus, if you had significant enough frame rate drops to where it actually impacted your ability to play the game, that was a serious problem. And while ordinarily I would say thankfully it only happens some of the time in Medal of Honor and most of the time the game is playable, most of the major performance issues actually occur toward the end of the game where you start encountering a lot more enemies being thrown at you at once, and it starts throwing a lot of the Panzerschreck enemies at you, which can one-shot you, so it really starts acting up right when you need it to be smooth, so you can actually aim at the targets you need to prioritize, and maneuver around the enemies so you don't get boxed in and annihilated. Hence me saying this is an issue that you really can't ignore. The texture warping effect I think most people can easily put up with, and some people actually find it rather endearing. The graphics being all low poly, low resolution, and severely dated, again, people can probably put up with that. The very simplistic weapon handling animations and the rather exaggerated character animations to make up for the lack of being able to do things like show expressions or lip syncing or anything like that, most people can probably put up with that. Rendering distance that actively interferes with your ability to spot enemies before they can take you out, and frame rate problems that are significant enough to impact your ability to control the game, on the other hand, not so much. But if all that is how the visuals and the performance are, what about the audio? Well, you do have to deal with this being a PlayStation 1 game, and thus all of the sound effects, the voice clips, and music all being severely bit crushed. But weirdly enough, most of the sound design actually still holds up remarkably well. This was right around the time when voice acting was becoming a lot more common in games, and not only do they have the Germans actually speaking German in a lot of cases, and it actually being perfectly acceptable German, but they also have some of them speaking goofily accented English, which gives a very playful, old-school war movie vibe. And that vibe continues with the soundtrack by Michael Giacchino, which is pretty much what you would expect from a classic adventure serial war movie type deal, which, after having listened to the soundtracks for the later entries in the Medal of Honor franchise, is unfortunately very familiar and quite bland and generic feeling, because the later Medal of Honor games had a really nasty habit of reusing soundtracks from previous games. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's well-made, good music, it's just that it ends up sounding really generic when you hear it over and over in other games, and other games ape that style as well. So this is a weird situation where even though the music itself is good and it does fit this game quite well, unfortunately, it has subsequently become very generic sounding by nature of just being imitated and reused so often that it becomes tiresome. It really is a situation where you had to be there back in the day and experience it when it was fresh, because otherwise it's just not going to have the same impact. And then you move over into the sound effects themselves, and you find that most of those still work pretty well, even though they are heavily bit crushed and thus quite low audio quality compared to what we would really like to hear. I mean, hell, when you look at the likes of the gun and explosion sounds, you end up with stuff like the M1 Garand in this actually sounding relatively beefy, whereas in Frontline and Allied Assault, for example, it barely even sounds like a firearm. I mean, the only real downside in the case of the original Medal of Honor is that you don't get the distinct ping when it ejects a clip. It just has a quick move down and back up to reload sequence. But that's something easily explained away as them trying to save on system resources a bit. And while it's certainly no European assault in terms of the general beefiness of the gun and explosion sounds for the Medal of Honor franchise, it's still remarkable just how well the audio in this game holds up, even with the lower audio quality. It's just a shame that when you look at the presentation as a whole, so much of it ends up being a mixed bag. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although there really isn't much of a unified story in this. It's really just more setup, which was a fairly common thing for games of that era. And the setup here is that you play as Lieutenant James Jimmy Patterson, who is recruited by the Office of Strategic Services in order to conduct various clandestine operations behind enemy lines in World War II in order to curtail the German war effort and, of course, lead to their ultimate defeat. There are only two other characters of any real note in the main storyline, and those are Colonel Hargrove, the man who recruited Jimmy into the OSS, who provides the voiceovers for all of the cutscenes in the game, as well as Manon Baptiste, a member of the French Resistance working with the OSS, who provides Jimmy with a text briefing at the start of each individual section of a mission. There's really not much to either of their characters, and apart from Jimmy being hyped up by the Colonel to just be a total badass, there's not really any characterization for Jimmy either. Thus, the meat of the writing is divided into just briefings for whatever mission you're going on, as well as whatever narration is going on in the cutscenes, which will either be a sort of primer for the mission you're going on, or a sort of documentary-style explanation of some particular aspect of the war, or a piece of equipment, or something along those lines. There's not really any dialogue to speak of, not just because Jimmy never actually says anything throughout the entire game, but also because the only real dialogue in massive air quotes that you get throughout the entire game is the occasional soldier asking you for your identification, you holding up your Ausweis and saying absolutely nothing, and them saying either you're not allowed in this area, or apologizing for the inconvenience and letting you pass. So since the only noteworthy writing you get throughout this game is really just the briefings for your various missions, there's just not really anything to assess there. It gives you the context for whatever mission you're going on, and that's it. There's no overarching story throughout the entire game. It's just Jimmy trying to complete various individual missions in an attempt to sabotage the German war effort. This means that ultimately everything in Medal of Honor falls to the gameplay, and, well, it's a console-exclusive first-person shooter from 1999 on the PlayStation, so it's a pretty rough experience. I know it's difficult to conceive this in a post-Halo world, but there was a time when gamepad controls really weren't all that well understood for first-person shooters. Medal of Honor is on the better end of that spectrum because there are at least a few presets that allow you to use the left stick for movement and the right stick for aiming and looking up and down. But you gotta remember that at this time, there were a lot of games trying things like splitting the movement between the sticks, so you would have forward and backward and then turning left and right on the left stick, and strafing left and right and looking up and down on the right stick, which was always really awkward and uncomfortable. Not to mention doing things like some of them having the fire button be R1, which is the right shoulder button instead of the right trigger button, while others might actually use R2, the effectively right trigger button, or they would use a face button for the fire command. It just varied wildly from game to game. In the case of Medal of Honor, the controls aren't quite what we would be considering for a sort of standard modern gamepad layout for a first-person shooter, but there are a couple of presets that are close enough. They at least let you use left stick for movement, right stick for aiming up and down and left and right, as well as using R2, the effective right trigger button, to be your fire button, and the left trigger, or L2, being your manual aim button. So you hold that down, it creates a crosshair on screen, and you can move the crosshair around to try to get more precision aiming. And of course, if you're using a sniper rifle, then it'll bring up the scope view and zoom in for you. The only real sticking point there is that you're going to get some weirdness with L1 and R1, the two shoulder buttons. For example, with the control layout I use, L1 is the crouch button and R1 is both action and reload. So that's kind of weird, but it's not so weird that it's unusable or anything. It's just one of those odd quirks of that era, and it's a fairly easy quirk to excuse because at least in this particular game, it's close enough to the modern gamepad control scheme that just makes plain sense. But even though the game has serviceable control schemes, the controls themselves just feel off at nearly all times. You never really feel like you can get any kind of precision out of the controls, and of course there's no crosshair by default unless you go specifically into the aiming mode, so you basically just have to line up enemies with the middle of your screen and hope that the aim assist takes over and actually hits the enemy where you're trying to hit them. That only works to about medium range though, so if you're trying to take out an enemy from long distance, then you need to go into the dedicated aim mode, which roots you in place and then lets you move around the crosshair on the screen in order to actually shoot the enemy in a more precise manner, or at least try to. You see, every single weapon in this game operates off of some sort of cone of fire mechanic, so a lot of times you'll be aiming directly at an enemy and shoot, and you'll watch your shot either move above them or below them because the cone of fire RNG mechanic isn't wanting to cooperate with you. So precision isn't really something you're going to get out of the various weapons in the original Medal of Honor, and nor is consistency of damage, because sometimes you'll shoot an enemy in the head and they'll drop instantly. Sometimes you'll shoot them in the head and it will just knock their helmet off, but they'll otherwise be fine. Sometimes you'll shoot an enemy once in the torso and they'll drop. Other times it will take 5 or 6 or more rifle rounds to bring them down. Or potentially more if you're using a submachine gun, or of course potentially less because the damage modeling is just so inconsistent that getting any kind of logical rule out of it is pretty much impossible. On the positive side, when you do hit an enemy, you'll notice because they will react to it with an animation. It's a good thing they do react to it with an animation because that's the only way you're going to know they got hit. Because while there are puffs of smoke when you shoot walls or floors, there aren't any when you hit enemies, and there aren't any blood puffs or gore of any kind either. So the only way you are going to know you hit an enemy is when they go into a sort of pain state animation. This does change somewhat once you get access to the bazooka, which is obviously treated as a rocket launcher that kills enemies in one shot, but since a lot of times you're in confined areas, it's a pretty bad idea to use the bazooka for fear of getting splash damage in your face. There is also the option of chucking grenades at enemies, but they're kind of odd in execution. If you hold the fire button down while the grenade is selected, then it will cook the grenade and then you throw it and it explodes sooner, but it'll also explode immediately if it hits an enemy, and the actual arc the grenade takes when you throw it is just odd. This is before grenade throwing physics really got truly sorted out. Only a few games were doing it decently, and it was particularly rough with console first-person shooters, so it's not exactly surprising that it was a problem in Medal of Honor as well. But apart from the bazooka and the grenades, the rest of the weapon selection is a bit of a crapshoot. I mean, you got a couple of submachine guns in the form of Thompson and the MP40, usually the MP40 throughout most of the game. You've got a BAR, you've got a Springfield .3 sniper rifle, of course the M1 Garand, an 1897 pump-action shotgun, and 3 different types of pistols, those being the suppressed pistol, which it's hard to tell exactly what they're going for there, but I think it's supposed to be a suppressed P38, and then apart from that, there is an unsuppressed Walther P38, as well as an M1911, and apart from the Springfield .3 sniper rifle, when you zoom in with the scope, they all suffer from this sort of cone of fire mechanic, and even the .3 suffers from the sort of random damage that seems to be done. There is also a bit of an odd quirk that amuses me because it's done for expediency of gameplay reasons, but it makes no logical sense, which is that ammo pickups are universal for different weapon classes. So, for example, if you take out an enemy that's using a rifle, then they will drop rifle rounds, even though the Kar 98 rifle that the Germans were using at the time is chambered in 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, and the Springfield .3 as well as the M1 Garand, and actually the BAR as well, are all chambered in 30-06, which, if you don't know in the millimeter conversion, is 7.62 by 63mm, so it's a longer total size round, but it's a smaller diameter bullet, so you can't actually interchange 30-06 and 7.92, and of course the same kind of thing is going to be true for 45 versus 9mm, and so on and so forth. A particularly funny quirk of this is that when you pick up SMG ammo and you have the BAR equipped, the BAR gets more rounds because the BAR counts as both the rifle slot and the SMG slot. It's one of those things where if you know anything about how firearms work, it's complete nonsense, but for a gameplay expediency purpose, I can at least understand why they did it. As a result of all this, the gunplay in Medal of Honor is just not very good. It's not awful, you can certainly still play through the entire thing, but it's definitely not mechanically satisfying when it comes to the first-person shooting mechanics. Then, of course, there's the movement, which is floaty and awkward. It's actually kind of difficult to describe exactly how the movement in this feels, because you'll get stuck on level geometry even when you're not actually anywhere near it. And when I say the movement is floaty, I mean it literally feels like you're gliding over the environments that you're moving through, rather than actually running, walking, or jogging your way through them. It really does feel like you're just a couple of arms holding whatever item you have equipped and just floating your way through the level like some sort of odd spirit. But then you end up in situations where you do actually have to jump, and the jumping physics are just strange. You have to sort of jump before you really intend to jump, because if you try to jump and you're too close to whatever it is you're trying to jump over, even if it's just a tiny thing in the environment, you'll just barely move upwards a bit and not be able to clear the obstacle. Again, it's just a strange feeling to the movement. It's something they would figure out in later Medal of Honor games, of course, but in the original it's all very rough and feels pretty clunky. So on a basic level as a first-person shooter, Medal of Honor is, well, not terrible necessarily for a console shooter of its era, but in general it's a fairly clunky and inconsistent experience, and compared to PC first-person shooters of the era, it's downright inadequate. But even though as a first-person shooter it's pretty lacking, it still does some things that are pretty interesting, namely things like their attempt at a stealth system, where in certain missions you are given a disguise and you have to hold up your Ausweis, your identification papers, in order to trick guards into letting you pass freely. In addition to the fake identity papers, you're also given a suppressed pistol because sometimes you'll need to take out enemies anyway, in particular so you can get the passes they drop in order to access certain other areas that you couldn't access before. Sort of like a key system, but not quite. And the idea here is that while you're running around with your disguise on, you're only going to have your papers and that suppressed pistol, and if you have the pistol out, then obviously the guards are going to take issue with that and start shooting at you and raise the alarm and such. Whereas if you don't have your pistol out, then as long as you have the appropriate passes for the area that you're in, you can just walk right past the enemy, and if they do stop and ask to see your papers, or they start questioning you, then you can hold up the identity papers and they'll say, "Oh, sorry sir," and then move on. Of course, this is all a very simplistic stealth system and really has absolutely no depth to it whatsoever, but it is a bit of a refreshing change of pace when it does initially pop up. It's just that over time, as you continue through these levels where you're wearing the disguise, it does get repetitive and dull. And unfortunately, those are really the only things to shake up the general gameplay, which consists almost exclusively of floating your way through the levels, shooting the enemies until they eventually stop moving, finding an objective item somewhere and picking it up, and occasionally going to whatever the objective is and pressing the action button. Later World War II games would add things like vehicle sections or sometimes even simply turret sequences to shake things up just a bit compared to what you're normally doing, but Medal of Honor was prior to all of those trends, so of course you don't get it here. Now that said, Medal of Honor isn't really so long that it becomes a problem. We're dealing with a game that's less than 4 hours long on the normal difficulty setting, but it does mean that the general experience of playing Medal of Honor is very simple, very straightforward, and extremely linear. They do try to shake up the level design a bit by offering some alternative paths to kind of flank around enemies, and some of the later levels do have a bit of a labyrinthine quality to them, but it's all still so linear that it's very difficult to get lost in this game, and there's not really any exploration to be done, not really any side content to find. It's all quite simple and quite straightforward, and if you haven't completed all of the objectives you're given on any given level, then when you get to the end of the level, it will give you a warning saying that you haven't completed all of those objectives, and you need to backtrack to whatever it was you missed and make sure that you get it completed, otherwise you fail the mission and have to start the entire level over. This part of the design is an annoyance. Whenever you either die or you end up failing a mission by not completing all of the objectives and going to the exit anyway, you have to start that entire level over again. Now, thankfully, because this is a PS1 game and the hardware simply wasn't capable of handling larger levels, most of the levels in this game are very short, and since it's all so straightforward, it's not that big of a deal to go through the whole thing again. But if you find a particular level where, say, they throw a bunch of Panzerschreck enemies at you, and they keep shooting you from off-screen and insta-killing you, well, that can get pretty irritating. And it really doesn't help that the progression in the game in general feels a bit stilted. By that I mean, whenever you complete a level, you're given the mission complete debriefing screen, and then you have to go through a sequence of menus to either save and then continue, or simply continue on, or return to the war room, which is the main menu. The thing is, if you're going into this from a more modern perspective, then you're not going to know immediately that there is no autosave in this game at all. This was before that was a thing, so if you want to save your progress, then you need to go through this sequence of rather slow menus in order to save your game to a memory card slot, and then you can continue on to either the next level or go back to the main menu. But the thing is that at the end of certain levels you have no choice but to go back to the main menu, because the way they've set this up is that you have your overarching mission, and then within that mission you have the individual levels you play through. So each mission gives you an idea of what the overarching objectives and context of the mission are, and that's when you get your briefing cutscene from the Colonel, and then from there, whenever you go into each individual mission, you get your text briefing from Manon, and after that, you go into the actual gameplay. When you get to the end of any given mission, you complete the last level of it, then it gives you the option to save like you normally would, but you're not given an option to continue on to the next mission. You have to go back to the main menu, and then from there you can select next mission, and then it goes into the next mission and plays the briefing cutscene, and this cycle continues. It's reminiscent of how games like Doom and Heretic and Quake all handled the episode system, where you would complete an episode, and then you would have to go back to the main menu in order to select the next episode. Medal of Honor has a very similar structure, and it does mean that the missions all feel kind of disjointed and feel like they're all individual self-contained things, which is exactly what they are anyway, so it's not a huge problem, but it does mean that cycling through these menus over and over again at the end of levels and at the end of missions does get fairly tedious. And when you bring all of that together, it really puts a damper on the experience of trying to play through Medal of Honor in hindsight. Obviously, if you were a console gamer back when this came out, it was considerably more impressive, but to be fair, console gamer standards for first-person shooters have always been pathetically low, especially in the 90s, where they were basically just happy if they had one that was even slightly functional. This is another one of those, I know it's hard to conceive of this these days, but back in the day, console first-person shooters were barely playable at best. So having one like this and having the vast majority of it actually being reasonably playable, except for a few instances here and there where the frame rate tanks and makes it actually quite difficult to control, would have felt considerably more impressive than an objective look at the game will tell you. And of course, it was the right game at the right time by the right people to capitalize on the World War II media craze that we had in the wake of stuff like Saving Private Ryan, so Medal of Honor's success in its day and the influence it's had on subsequent games isn't exactly surprising. The thing is that when you look at it as a game in and of itself, it's really not great. It's serviceable. If you have an afternoon to kill, you can probably play through this game and have an okay time with it. But as far as being a first-person shooter in general, it just doesn't hold up very well. It's certainly interesting to look at from a historical perspective as sort of the catalyst that really jumped the World War II shooter craze into action, and I certainly respect the game a lot for its historical significance, but it's not something I'm just going to recommend to a general audience as a first-person shooter. If you want to play a Medal of Honor game and just enjoy it, then I would recommend European Assault and pretty much nothing else. It is, however, one of the more eminently playable first-person shooters on the original PlayStation, so if you absolutely must play a first-person shooter on PlayStation, well, I guess you could definitely do worse than this, but just understand going into it that the experience is going to be pretty rough. It's going to be a very short game at about less than 4 hours long, and there's really no replay value to speak of. The game does have a multiplayer mode, which is just a 2-player versus split screen, but it's a very simplistic, very basic multiplayer mode that just doesn't hold a candle to the likes of other console first-person shooters of the era, like, say, GoldenEye or Perfect Dark. It really wouldn't be until the next generation of consoles, PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, that we would start to see console shooters really start to pick up steam and actually produce things that are worth playing. That, of course, doesn't mean that the original Medal of Honor deserves to be forgotten. It was certainly an influential game in its era, and it deserves respect for that, but just understand that if you're trying to find a game to play and enjoy, it's probably not going to be the game for you unless you're just really into old, clunky, retro first-person shooters. Thank you all very much for watching. It's taken me quite a long time to get around to reviewing Medal of Honor, and from here there's only 2 other games in the series that I haven't covered yet, which are Medal of Honor Underground, the direct follow-up to this game, as well as Medal of Honor Infiltrator, which was the GBA game that's kind of a top-down arcadey shooter. And while I do have copies of both of them, I'm not exactly sure when I will get around to making videos on those. I do certainly plan on making reviews of both of those, and I'm also planning on doing a redux of the reboot from 2010 at some point. I'm just not sure when that'll be, because that's the oldest video on any of the Medal of Honor games I've made, and it's the crappiest of the videos. So it definitely needs a redux at some point, but other than that, I do plan on potentially revisiting Medal of Honor Rising Sun, considering that I was trying to play that on backwards compatibility on Xbox 360 and it just didn't work. And now that I have an OG Xbox and it's all hooked up for me to record, I should be able to play through that in full now, as opposed to having to suffer through all of the backwards compatibility issues on 360, so maybe I'll revisit Rising Sun eventually and do a proper review, not sure. Might also revisit Airborne because that's the second oldest of the Medal of Honor videos, and it's the second crappiest of them. But as for the other games in the Medal of Honor series, probably not going to revisit them, and like I said earlier in the video, probably not going to do a video on Above and Beyond, the VR exclusive game either. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, definitely stay tuned. I hope you all enjoyed the video, thanks again for watching, and if you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. But anyway, thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.